Hey, welcome back. I'm Zsolt. If you watched my previous video, you will know that I have some concerns about AI tools, especially sharing all my personal notes with a tool like ChatGPT. I know it would give me amazing insights and new connections and creative ideas, but because I don't know what is going to happen with my data, I have privacy concerns. But that doesn't mean that I don't use AI tools on a daily basis. Indeed, they've become second nature. I use them every hour, not every day. I use tools like Midjourney, ChatGPT, Notebook LM, and a whole host of others, and they are really part of my everyday. And in fact, today I want to share with you two new workflows that I've been experimenting with that balance privacy with creativity and productivity. I think these two workflows blend these two worlds together very nicely. I'm going to include timestamps, so we're going to talk about one, and then later on in the video I'm going to share about a second workflow. So if the first one is not so interesting, you can jump ahead and look at the second one. I think both are very interesting workflows. They are changing the way I think. They are almost like a paradigm shift about how I read and process information. So the first one is about reading books, especially nonfiction books. And before we dive into the process, let me just show you some of the output that I was able to generate using this workflow. So in Cohort 11 of the Visual Thinking Workshop, we are reading The Extended Mind by Annie Murphy-Paul. And I thought it would be nice to create summaries where I demonstrate the different ways our brain works with the external environment and tools in personas. So you can see here that, for example, chapter 1, Thinking with Sensations, I came up with three personas: the detective, the nature observer, and the paramedic. I'm not going to go into details. Maybe I'll do a book on a page later on. Here I just want to highlight these three personas, and then if I look at chapter 2, Thinking with Movement, I have the dancer, the athlete, and the sculptor, and then I have the pantomime artist, the pre-verbal communicator, and the conductor, and so on. The gazer, the camper, the nurturer, and then here I have the monk, the nesting parent, and the architect. And I think this way of capturing each chapter's essence is such a neat way. For me, all of these personas have so much to say and they remind me so vividly about the book. But let me show you how I got to this point. And before that, let me take one step back and just share a couple of thoughts about audiobooks. Because in the past, you asked me 1 month ago even, I would have said that audiobooks are fantastic for fiction. If it's narrated well, it can be a super immersive experience. But when it comes to non-fiction, it comes to technical books, business books, self-help books, I found that audiobooks are useless. The more abstract the topic, the harder it is to concentrate to an audiobook. And I found that I may listen to an audiobook on a topic, but by the end, I have absolutely no recollection of what the book was about. Maybe I can talk for 5 minutes about the book, but ask me any detail and it's gone. I couldn't capture it in my mind. And my advocacy has been that if you're reading something non-fiction, then get a copy of the book, either a physical book or a Kindle. Do your highlights, import the highlights into your note-taking system. Go through a process like progressive summarization, create illustrations, book on a page summaries, integrate the knowledge into your other notes, and then you will internalize it. And now with the extended mind, I'm experimenting with a new workflow, and I think it is really working very well. The workflow is very simple. All I do is, as I read, I have ChatGPT open on my phone, so I'm listening to the book on Audible on my phone, and I have the ChatGPT app also open on my phone. And after about 5 to 10 minutes of listening to a chapter, I pause the chapter and I head over to ChatGPT and start an interactive voice conversation. There I share some of my reflections with ChatGPT, and then we have a short discussion. I explain to ChatGPT that I don't want long conversations. I'm using it more as a reflective notebook, but equally, in some cases, the feedback I'm getting from ChatGPT helps me fine-tune the ideas I have, or helps me articulate those ideas better, especially as I'm not a native speaker. For me, having that additional help to articulate my ideas properly helps. And so that's essentially the workflow, that as I go through the book, I pause every few minutes whenever there's an interesting idea or it triggers an idea. I note down connections to my vault. So for example, here I'm noting down a connection to thinking fast, thinking slow, and system 2 thinking, but I have some other links mentioned as well. And what I'm like here, you can see I'm referencing the tipping point. So, and the way I'm using GPT here is as a reflective partner who's able to summarize at the end. So the important thing here is when I get to the end of all of this, I ask GPT to create a summary for me. Yeah, it's somehow here you go. So here's the summary. And then in Obsidian, I add this summary. So you can see here, I imported this summary. So I don't import chapter highlights. I don't import anything from the book. All I do is I import the summary of my conversation with GPT into my note in Obsidian. And then I flip this note around. If you don't understand what flipping a note around is, I'm going to link a video in the description that explains the two-sided notes. I flip this note around, and on the other side of the note, I created the illustration that we discussed with GPT. There are a couple of practical learnings along the way that I wanted to share. So learning number 1 is when I speak for a long time. So if I'm doing reflections and it's a longer reflection, then GPT has a tendency of interrupting me. But what I also learned is if I press and hold the screen, then GPT will not respond until I let go of the screen. So that's a great way of reflecting and not feeling that I'm under time pressure and need to continually talk. That's a great approach. The second learning I took away is if I sit at the computer and I do the same process, I get distracted. I listen to the book and then I think I can multitask and I start to browse the net, and there it goes. The experience is gone. So for doing this process, I recommend that you do something as you do this. You pace around your room, you go for a walk in the park. I even did this during driving, because essentially listening to an audiobook and then chatting with GPT, that doesn't really require my attention on the phone. And if you're driving in city traffic, you're standing anyway in line or at the traffic light, you have plenty of time to use these tools. So I found that for this, at least for me, for this workflow to work, I need to be engaged in some activity that prevents me from wandering off in other directions. Then the third learning I had is when GPT creates the summary, I recommend doing the summary immediately after you finish the chapter. So don't go from chapter to chapter to chapter to chapter, but at the end of each chapter, create the summary, import it into your note-taking system, create the illustration, and then move on to the next chapter. This is going to help you solidify what you've read so far, as well as then the ideas are still fresh in your mind. So I did find that sometimes GPT excluded things from the summary that I thought were important or included new ideas that I didn't say. And I'm sure that if I had imported those summaries a couple of days later, I would have not remembered. So reviewing GPT's output fresh immediately is, I think, very helpful, or it's a good idea to do. And the fourth best practice, or at least my practice, is I started a new chat for each chapter. So if I come here, you can see that for each chapter, thinking with built spaces, sensations, movement, space of ideas, nature, etc., I have a separate chat, and at the beginning of each chat, I have this short explanation to GPT that I'm listening to the book, I'm taking mental notes, I don't want long conversations, I rather just want to use it as a note-taking tool, and I'll prompt it when I want to discuss. And this way, I can segregate each of the chapters. For me, it's just easier to handle. It doesn't become one long conversation, and also I can avoid things spilling over from one chapter to the other, so these are then more segregated conversations. But yeah, so that's the first workflow, and I think this is super powerful. I very much enjoy doing this. I don't have a GPT subscription, so I'm using the free version, and it is good enough for me, and the workflow works. So I think this is really an easy thing to do. You don't need any subscriptions. Grab an audiobook and try this workflow. I promise you, this is going to be a new experience that will change the way you think about reading. One final thought, and that links back to Thinking with Movement from Murphy Paul. And the basic idea is that as a species, we were evolved to move, and thinking still and concentrating is not natural, not our natural strength. And I think there's an interesting dilemma here, because reading, you can only do sitting down, because if you move, the letters move, it's almost impossible to read while walking, or at least you will read much slower and walk slower. It's going to be very inefficient in both ways. So I think the additional value of this new workflow that I'm doing is indeed I'm able to bring in the element of motion in how I'm reading. And Murphy Paul explains that motion has lots of positive effects on our cognitive abilities. So in that sense, I think if you go for a walk in the park, especially, so I think Thinking with Natural Spaces explains how parks are much better for thinking than built spaces like cities. If you go for a walk in a park and you listen to the audiobook and you talk with ChatGPT on your notes, I think you're going to have a super immersive reading experience. Now, onto the other workflow I want to share with you. And the other workflow, let me show you the output that I was able to generate with that workflow. So you can see this mind map is a mind map of all the different benefits and facets of visual thinking. So this is a whole host of ideas about the different types and tools for visual thinking, as well as the different benefits and use cases for visual thinking. This is a huge mind map. By the way, if you want to access this mind map, I'm going to include a link in the video description. I've posted it here on the Visual Thinking Workshop website. There's a podcast to this, and I'm going to get to that in a second. You can download the podcast, as well as I have the Excalibur drawing right here. So you can explore this, as well as if you want, you can save it as a file to your own Excalibur environment, and you can rearrange this mind map and use it as your input, as well as I included all these different book covers here. So if a topic interests you, these are the books that you can purchase to explore that topic further. So this can also be a very good starting point to explore the idea of visual thinking. But in terms of the workflow of how I got to this, I used this tool called Notebook LM. And what I did was I imported all the books and notes I have around visual thinking into Notebook LM. So this is now everything that I've read and come across regarding visual thinking. And then I went through a couple of rounds of prompts. So let me show you my workflow here. This is the overall workflow that I went through. So I uploaded my books to Notebook LM. Then I generated a podcast overview. You can prompt Notebook LM with a podcast. So here, if I delete this podcast, then you will see that I can customize my podcast prompt, and I can just add whatever. I have a limitation of 500 characters, but I can guide Notebook LM on the prompt. And I think if I come back here, this was my final prompt. So these were the 500 characters that I used to generate the podcast that you find here on the Visual Thinking Workshop website. So this podcast. So I uploaded my podcast here, and then once I was happy with the podcast, I downloaded the podcast from Notebook LM. I converted it with Audacity to MP3, so I can import it into my Obsidian Vault, and that it's not too big of a file. So this is my podcast. And then I also used Notebook LM to transcribe the file. So the downloaded podcast, what I did with the downloaded podcast is here. I clicked on Add Source, and I dragged in here the downloaded audio file, and that creates so this is now the transcription of its own podcast. And so all I did was I copied this podcast from here into my note in Obsidian. So you can see here that here's my podcast transcript. And then I also saved this podcast transcript in a file, and I headed over to ChatGPT, and I uploaded my podcast here, and I asked it to create a mermaid mind map of this podcast, returning the results in a code block. It first created a mind map, but unfortunately Obsidian Excalibur or Excalibur in processing Mermaid doesn't handle mind maps well. So then I went and asked GPT to change this into the flowchart type of Mermaid chart. And all I did was I copied this Mermaid chart to the clipboard and went over to Excalibur. And in Excalibur here, under more tools, there's the Mermaid to Excalibur feature. So I came here and pasted my chart in here. It was actually a top-down chart. So this is how it looked first, but I changed top-down to left-right, and I inserted this in here. And then, of course, I did some tweaks. I changed the color to white. I changed the line to sharp instead of rounded. And I did this, that I selected some of the branches like this one here. I grouped all the elements, and then I flipped it horizontally like this. And so I could start to move these items to the to the right or to the left. So it became more of a mind mappy thing. And then, of course, as I was then reading the page, so let me delete this here and show you what I did. So I split. So first, let me change to Markdown view mode. Here I selected to split this to the right. And on the right hand side, I had the mind map. First, it was just the mind map I automatically created that I started to then rearrange, and I had the text here. And as I read the text, I started to create these illustrations. Now, of course, each of these book covers are a link to my vault. So this also then is my map of content for visual thinking, because if I look at here the backlinks in Obsidian, you will see that, the forward links, you will see that these are all the links to the different books I have, or maybe I can also show you this with Excalibrain, how this all looks like. So you can see here that in Excalibrain, I have all the books referenced here one by one, and this is a jump off point to then explore each of these books further and some of the topics. Like, for example, here I have flow, and of course for flow I have my illustration here that continues on. Anyway, this now takes us on a completely different path. That I process my notes like this. I did the transcript, as I explained, by feeding in the material to NotebookLM itself, and it created me the transcript. I generated the mermaid outline of my mind map using ChatGPT. And then here, this is the last part where I rearranged the branches. I was listening to the podcast that was generated. I was reading my notes, and I created these cards for key ideas. I could go and ask NotebookLM. So NotebookLM can provide you with a podcast, but also you can ask questions here to interrogate the documents you have. So whenever something was not clear, I was able to do further research. And all in all, with this, I created this overview of visual thinking that connects all the books, all the materials I read into one concise overview that is super helpful for me as a jump off point in the future, finding information about visual thinking. And I think this is just such a neat new workflow. It creates this external loop where I have a whole body of knowledge that I then input into NotebookLM. I get back a rejigged storyline, and through that storyline, I can look at what I know already from a different perspective. It gives me really a different view on the subject that I'm already familiar with, and that helps me uncover so many new insights and so many new ideas. So, in a nutshell, these are the two workflows I wanted to share with you. One, listening to audiobooks and taking mental notes in ChatGPT. The other is feeding in a body of knowledge to NotebookLM, generating a podcast, downloading the text, creating a mind map, and then creating this visual integration of the topic that you're familiar with from a completely new lens, a new perspective. I think these two workflows are fundamentally changing how I'm working with information and how I'm working with knowledge. They link back to visual thinking. They help me connect my ideas, but they also don't require me sharing all my notes with these tools. I can be selective. In this case, I was sharing books and articles, not my own notes, but external notes with the tool. So in that sense, I was not sharing any of my private information or very minimal amount of private information to help guide it. The same is true with the workflow, the reading workflow for the extended mind. Of course, I was sharing some of my reflections, but I think these reflections are all very nicely ring-fenced within a small topic area of the book. So I feel that that is much less of a privacy concern than sharing all my notes. I recommend that you try these two workflows. Both of them are free. NotebookLM is free, ChatGPT is free, and all of these tools, Excalibur and Obsidian, is also free tools. So I think from a financial perspective, there's nothing stopping you from exploiting these tools, but there's so much upside. I really don't see much downside to this, but I see lots of upsides to experimenting with these workflows. And finally, I'd love if you could share your workflows in the comments below. I continue to experiment and explore AI tools and how they can help my personal knowledge management workflow. And I'm sure that there are so many other good ideas out there. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your workflows. For example, I wouldn't have found NotebookLM if Andy from the Visual Thinking Workshop had not recommended it to me. So yeah, this is the way you can find stuff, that you hear about it from someone and you can then apply it. So please, in the comments below, let me know what workflows you're using, what tools you're using, how it's shaping your thinking, how it's a paradigm shift or maybe not, what efficiencies it brings. I'm extremely interested. So thank you for watching until the end, and I hope to see you in my next video.